may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, so as we work on this 2021 draft guide, I mean, there's probably no wide receiver at the very top harder to rank than Calvin Ridley. I mean, we have him locked into our wide receiver 5, but the question is this a tier 2 wide receiver? Should he be there with A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf for 2021? Or is he a tier 1 wide receiver? Is this someone that needs to be up with Tyreek Hill, DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs? That's the question that we're facing. So I really want to dive into this video, not necessarily just what happened last year. Let's look at Calvin Ridley's entire career up to date, because he's only been here for 3 years. We understand that, yes, this past year was the first year he broke out into that elite range, but I think if we understand the trajectory that he's on, we'll have a much better understanding on how we should accurately rank him. But of course, guys, please go down there, drop that like, leave that comment. And of course, you can pre-order our 2021 Fantasy Football Draft Guide, which should be available around July 20th over there on Patreon. But yeah, drop that like, leave that comment, letting me know where you are going to be drafting Calvin Ridley in this year's draft. And let's dive into the player himself, who is currently, like we said, our wide receiver 5. And he's the wide receiver 5 in ADP. So I'm not even sitting here saying that we are higher than a lot of people on Calvin Ridley. I think the question is he in tier 1? Is he a tier 1 player? Can we be drafting him confidently there? Can you make the argument for him being ahead of Devontae Adams if Aaron Rodgers does move from Green Bay? Now, he is only 26 years old, which is actually kind of old for a player that's only played 3 years in the NFL so far. But what's weird with Calvin Ridley is it's not like he stayed at Alabama forever. He just didn't get to Alabama until he was like 20 years old. I mean, this is someone that stayed in high school for a very, very long time. But anyway, if we go through his career so far, I mean, in his rookie season, he actually broke out right away. He had 13 points per game, was a top 30 wide receiver. He was the wide receiver 28. Now, a lot of this was fueled off of touchdown volume. We know that touchdowns are the most volatile statistic in fantasy football season to season, but he did get almost 6 targets a game, and he had a little over 51 receiving yards. And he just continued to build on this in 2019. And this is what you love to see from Calvin Ridley, because it's not like you had season after season after season of mediocre play from Calvin Ridley, and then all of a sudden he jumped up to being a superstar. No, that's not what it was at all. All of a sudden in 2019, Calvin Ridley continues to progress. He averages 15 points per game, was the wide receiver 18 this season, so a mid wide receiver 2, 67 receiving yards a game, slightly over 7 targets. So obviously, this is a bump across the board for Calvin Ridley. And what's even more impressive is if we go into it and we understand, hell, Matt Ryan left in the middle of the season early with an injury. If we remove that game that Matt Ryan only played a little bit of football, and we also remove the game afterwards where Matt Ryan was actually injured, did not start, then all of a sudden you have Calvin Ridley as the wide receiver 10, which is obviously notable. I mean, I think it's safe to say that you should be looking at the sample where Matt Ryan was the starter for Calvin Ridley and what we can try to project going forward. So this was essentially a wide receiver 1 breakout for Calvin Ridley in his sophomore season. And then we get to 2020, and this is when he just jumps into a completely different planet. I mean, here he comes out, averages almost 19 points per game, is the wide receiver 4 in fantasy, has over 91 yards a game, 9.5 targets as well. And now I know a lot of people are going to be saying, but Mason, isn't that just because Julio Jones missed a lot of time? Which is true. Yes, Julio Jones missed a considerable amount of time in 2020. So you can't just look at this situation on a whole and go, okay, 18.9 points per game. That's what Calvin Ridley did this past year. Let's not look at anything else. No, you have to dive deep into it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to remove the games where Calvin Ridley left early with an injury, or possibly he just missed them entirely. At that point, you take away any game that Calvin Ridley did not play over 70% of the snaps in, because we know Calvin Ridley, he's a player that if he's healthy, he's playing at least 75, 85, 90% of the snaps for this team. If you remove those games, Calvin Ridley actually averaged over 21 fantasy points per game. That is massive. So every time that Calvin Ridley was healthy, he was averaging over 21 fantasy points per game. Now, what is really weird is if you remove the games where Julio Jones was also injured, if you remove the games where Julio Jones played less than 70%, and we are only looking at the weeks where both Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones each played 70% of the snaps. In those weeks in particular, Calvin Ridley averaged 23.7 points per game. That would make him the wide receiver 1 in fantasy. That is absurd. And no, I don't necessarily have an explanation for this. I don't think you can just continue to say that Calvin Ridley playing with Julio Jones is better than Calvin Ridley playing without Julio Jones, even though that's what the numbers show. Understand that this was a very, very small sample size. And while yes, you can make the argument that with Julio Jones in the offense, that the opposing defense really has to pay so much attention to Julio that it opens more things up for Calvin Ridley, which is entirely true. So you should be expecting the efficiency to be up for Calvin Ridley when Julio Jones is in the game because he takes so much of that defense's attention. But what we also have to understand is you're going to be projecting at the minimum 20% of the team's targets going over to Julio Jones, and that's going to cause the Calvin Ridley volume to dip down. So while you see a bump up in efficiency with Julio Jones in the situation, you do see a bump down in volume. And we know based on meta-analysis, based on so many studies that have been shown in fantasy football over the past few years, you chase volume, 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 and you fade efficiency. Volume is the main thing that you're wanting to see. So it's very hard to say that Calvin Ridley is a better wide receiver in town with Julio Jones there. Although that's what the numbers show, I don't want that to be the takeaway. What I want to be the takeaway from these numbers is the fact that Calvin Ridley broke out into an elite tier in 2020, regardless of if Julio Jones was active or if Julio Jones was not active. It didn't matter the scenario. Calvin Ridley was an elite wide receiver. So that's where I'm kind of sitting at right now. I don't want this 2020 season to be attributed to the health of Julio Jones for the Calvin Ridley production. I think based on the breakout that he had, I mean, the more I talk about it, the more I convince myself that Calvin Ridley is in tier 1. He is with DeAndre Hopkins. He is with Devontae Adams. He is with Tyreek Hill. And how you classify a tier 1 wide receiver is you look through and you go, what players had the potential to finish at number 1 overall? And I think Calvin Ridley does have that potential in 2021. But obviously, Julio Jones leaving town is going to change some things for other players in this offense. So I want to go through, talk Russell Gage. I want to talk Kyle Pitts. I want to talk Matt Ryan. At the end, we'll talk Matt Ryan and what it means for Calvin Ridley, Russell Gage, and Kyle Pitts. But let's start it off with Russell Gage, keeping it at the wide receiver position. And right now, in high-stakes redraft leagues, Russell Gage is the wide receiver 49 in ADP. So you're getting him as a late wide receiver 4 or an early wide receiver 5. And we have him in our own rankings at the moment. Like I said, guys, that draft guide is not out yet, so maybe we tweak some things here or there, but we have him as the wide receiver 42. Now, we have him ranked directly behind Jalen Waddle, Brandon Cooks, and Curtis Samuel, just to give you an idea of where he is compared to some of these other veteran wide receivers. And with Russell Gage, obviously, he had the best year of his career in 2020. He finished as the wide receiver 49 in points per game with 11.316. But what's way more important is trying to look at Russell Gage and trying to determine what his productivity is going to be this upcoming season with a role that Russell Gage has really rarely ever seen. So what we are doing for this sample is we are setting the bar very low. We are just going, let's look at Russell Gage in any game that Calvin Ridley or Julio Jones were nicked up at all. And how we are doing that is we are going to be looking for games where Russell Gage played at least 60% of the snaps. Because we know, hey, with no Julio Jones, with the depth chart just being completely barren, I mean, behind Gage, you have Olamide Zaccheaus, you have Christian Blake, you have nobody. I mean, you should be expecting Russell Gage to, at the very minimum, play 60% of snaps every single game this upcoming season, most likely way more than that. But anyway, in those games, Russell Gage actually averaged slightly over 13 points per game, which would have been good for making him the wide receiver 36 in fantasy. Now, I know a lot of people have wanted to come out and said Russell Gage has the upside to be a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. I'm not viewing it that way. I think it's very hard to say that Russell Gage is going to be a wide receiver 2, as we saw last year whenever he did have a large enough role. This is a player that was a low-end wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 4. But regardless, he is someone that has upside in this offense. He is someone that should finish way higher than he's being drafted. So I was surprised to see how much higher we are on Russell Gage after doing the research compared to consensus, because I'm going to be completely honest, before we made the official rankings, before we went out there and wrote that draft guide, I thought I was going to be lower than consensus on Russell Gage. I did not expect to be someone that was pumping Russell Gage out here to y'all, but here we are, and this is what we are doing. Now, obviously, another variable coming into this offense that is literally massive. I mean, he's 6'6", 245 pounds, is going to be Kyle Pitts. And yes, at the beginning of the offseason, before the Julio Jones trade, I was coming out here and I was calling Kyle Pitts the worst pick in fantasy. I thought that in a redraft league, when Kyle Pitts was going as the tight end 4 before the Julio Jones trade, ahead of TJ Hawkinson, ahead of Dallas Goedert, ahead of Noah Fant, I thought it was crazy. I couldn't get behind it, and I was calling it the worst pick in fantasy. Even in dynasty fantasy football, I thought he was overvalued when he was being drafted ahead of Trey Lance, Justin Fields in Superflex leagues, and when he was being drafted ahead of Najee Harris. I thought all of that was crazy. Now, Julio Jones gets traded, and the overall equation for this offense has completely changed, where we're having to change our stance before the season even starts. Because we've always acknowledged the fact that Kyle Pitts, the best tight end prospect of all time, he comes in at 20 years old. Keep in mind, only 20 years old, and he has already put up a season in the SEC where he averaged 96 receiving yards. That does not happen at the tight end position at that early of an age. Though in the fact that he had 12 touchdowns in only 8 games, that makes that productivity so much better. But we know what is surprising based on the historical research we've done over there on Patreon at the tight end position, evaluating these rookies coming in, is speed and overall athleticism matters so much for the tight end position. I mean, matters more for tight ends than it does for any other position in fantasy. And here Kyle Pitts at 6'6", 245 pounds, ran a 4.44 40-yard dash. Now that never happens. You never have this size-adjusted athleticism, and you never have this kind of productivity at such an early age. Now, you combine both of them with one player, and it's safe to say that Kyle Pitts, there's a reason he's the highest tight end ever drafted in the NFL draft, because he's the best tight end to ever come into the NFL. Now, historically, tight ends have been very bad with their rookie season production. And this is because the tight end position, besides quarterback, is easily the hardest position to be able to come in and play right away in the NFL, as you essentially have to learn how to be an offensive lineman. You have to learn how to be a wide receiver at the same time. But a lot of people are speculating that Kyle Pitts is going to be used more as a move tight end, more as a guy that's just going to be running wide receiver routes at the NFL level, at least for his first year. And that makes sense with Julio Jones being gone, which is why we're having to move Kyle Pitts up. But I will say, if you go over there on that Dynasty Rookie Draft Guide, as well as on our 2021 Fantasy Football Draft Guide, we are still going to be slightly lower than consensus on Kyle Pitts. I still think you need to draft TJ Hawkinson over him, but I can't continue to come out here and say that Kyle Pitts is the most overvalued player in fantasy. He's going to be going in the 4th round of redraft leagues, which I cannot pay that price. But if you're playing in a casual format where not that many people know who Kyle Pitts is, and you can get him in the 6th, I'm completely fine with that. So what is going to tie this offense all together, and what is really just going to be the leverage factor on if any of these players actually return value, is going to be Matt Ryan. And here with Matt Ryan, I have a confession to make. So I have been coming out calling Matt Ryan completely washed, calling him a quarterback that simply doesn't have the arm talent anymore and shouldn't be a quarterback in the NFL. Well, we have been doing that mainly off of narrative, mainly off of what I believed to be Matt Ryan's 2020 season. And I have to admit, Matt Ryan has not gotten any worse at the game of football than he's been over his entire career. Now, yes, with Matt Ryan, what is so weird is you have no consistency whatsoever. If you pull up his career-long numbers, it is like a roller coaster. I mean, one year you're out there, you're almost so close to winning the Super Bowl. The next year, you're one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL over and over and over and over again. But if we go back to 2020, where I thought that Matt Ryan was atrocious, I thought that this was the season that said Matt Ryan is done. He actually averaged 7.4 yards adjusted per attempt. Now, if we go through and look at that, while no, that's not near the top of the NFL, that's nothing like Patrick Mahomes or Russell Wilson or anything of the sort, it's not out of the ordinary for Matt Ryan. It doesn't show us that he's declining in play, because this is the 7th worst mark in his NFL career, and he's played 13 years. So literally it's dead average with the play that you've had from Matt Ryan. So I don't want to be saying Matt Ryan is a bottom 5 starting quarterback in the NFL. I think we just need to be saying that Matt Ryan is the quarterback he's always been. I'm definitely not drafting Ryan in fantasy at all this year. With no Julio Jones, I'm viewing him as an option in redraft leagues where you have a waiver wire. He's a streamer. If he has a good matchup, pick him up, put him in, but he's nobody that I want any business with starting throughout the course of the entire season. So with Matt Ryan, I think I overblew how bad he was going to be and how he was going to tank this offense, where we have no justification in actually doing that. But obviously, we have one other change happening here. Arthur Smith coming in, former offensive coordinator from the Tennessee Titans. And what's going to be interesting is what you are finding from this offense in how many runs and how many passes they have in neutral game scenarios. Because we know that Arthur Smith really was just run, play action in Tennessee. And it came with incredible efficiency. But how much of that was due to Derrick Henry? Probably a lot. So understanding that Derrick Henry had so much to do with the fact that the Titans last year only passed the ball 30 times a game, I think that it's hard to take anything away from it. If Arthur Smith comes over and he thinks he can do the same thing with Mike Davis, I think this offense is going to tank in efficiency. But if he goes through and he kind of just changes the game plan to match their personnel, Arthur Smith has showed that he is very capable at doing so. And I think you should be excited about the coaching change in Atlanta. But it's very hard to say that if this is going to be an offense that relies just on efficiency or if it's going to be a passing offense that has a lot of volume like in years past, because I think that it's hard to decipher the personnel from the coach unless we have that very large sample. Now, thank you, my dudes. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. Of course, go down there, drop that like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton, and I'll see y'all with the video tomorrow. I want to give a big thank you for everyone joining the flock over there on Patreon. In Castro, Brian, Mike, Jay, Samuel, Billy, Rocky, Bailey, Zachary, and Andrew. Thank you, my dudes.